Hello to all members of SUG Chennai. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I welcome you all to the webinar on working with Sitecore's ASP.NET Core Rendering SDK with our esteemed guest speaker, Anindita, who is a Sitecore MVP from India. I thank you all for joining us in this exciting webinar, and I thank Anindita for accepting to share her expertise and taking time out of her busy schedule. Let's get ready to embark on an enlightening journey into the world of Sitecore's ASP.NET Core Rendering SDK with Anindita. This stage is all yours, Anindita. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nizar. Thank you for to all the organizers of SUG Chennai. I think it's the second or third time I'm presenting with you guys. It's always a good experience. Um, so let's get started. I'm sorry if you hear dog barking now, noises in the background. It's like my dog decides to give company to everybody on the street if somebody barks. I'm sorry about that. So, all right, let's get started then. So my name is Anindita Bhattacharya. I work as a Siteco consultant, and I have been doing Siteco development for almost 10 years now. Uh, Today I'm going to be talking about ASP.NET Core Rendering SDK with Sitecore, which is one of the options in Sitecore's headless offering. Um, so um, yeah, Sitecore's headless offerings as such have been around for a few years now. I know that JSS is a more, I guess, common option or more used option as such, but it was actually a surprise for me to know when I actually started looking out for an ASP.NET Core option that this was available because I actually haven't seen any client implementations on this yet. So this was a pretty interesting thing for me to explore. I'm sure everybody is aware at this point about what headless is, and given that the fact that even Sitecore has jumped onto it almost for what 3-4 years back now. So in headless development, basically what we're doing is we are separating out your the backend or the content store from your front end or the website in a much more meaningful manner than just having them separated within the same solution. So in this case, they're pretty much completely separate entities, and that also helps in keeping them completely independent of each other, and even the technology dependence is not in place in that case. So that, according to me, is the most the biggest selling point as such of going headless, and the fact that you can have many different endpoints and different applications, different kinds of applications listening to the same content as such. So that I think would be the main thing. So moving on to Sitecore's headless way of doing things. In Sitecore, the way they have set up the headless way as such is you have the core product, which in this case is pretty much similar to um, sorry about the background noises again, but yeah. The core product remains the same, where you have Sitecore's item repository, personalization engine, and presentation layer. But this, on the left side, you see this is the vanilla, MVC way of doing things, or the more traditional way of doing things with Sitecore, where you have the rendering engine talking to Sitecore and getting the content, and then the razor markup or whatever markup that you write, it basically renders that onto the screen in the form of HTML. So while you do have some amount of separation, especially using MVC design pattern, they are still kind of tightly tied, as in they are still a single entity as such. So that is what we're trying to break free from. So in case of the headless way of doing things here, so you can see that there is a layout service, and this case we're speaking about layout service because that's the most common service that is in use. So the layout service is the one which is exposed to any consuming third party. In this case, we're talking about a front end created using any of the rendering SDKs. But the layout service is the one which is speaking to Sitecore as such, as in the Sitecore backend. and any website in front in or any kind of receiving application can use this consume this layout service and use that rendering SDKs, mainly because if you use any rendering SDK, be it the options that you have with the JavaScript SDKs or the ASP.NET Core rendering SDK, you get the added sidecore features, things like experience editor, WYSIWYG editing within the experience editor, and excuse me, and your personalization support and testing support, and your marketing features and everything. So you get uh, support of all of those if you're using the rendering SDKs. Now, one thing to note is, and I have actually seen this quite recently in use, is that obviously it's not mandatory that rendering SDK is not the only way that you can consume the sitecore data or the sitecore content stored that you have. There might be other scenarios as well, like suppose you have a mobile app being created with Flutter. So in that case, you can still obviously consume the data that is coming from the layout service, and you can still content manage everything inside Core and use it purely as the CMS. But all the added features of Sitecore, things like experience editor and analytics and all of that, may not be available in that case as well as it might be, if you're using an SDK. Now, in when it comes to the rendering SDKs that we're talking about, there are two main categories here, which is the JavaScript based, and then the second is obviously the ASP.NET Core renderings that we're going to be talking about. So you can see that the JavaScript SDKs, you actually have options like the React, Angular, and Vue, and you can choose to build your website with any of these. And the other option, obviously, is the ASP.NET Core Rendering SDK. Now, whatever option you choose, they will be talking to the same layer as such, as in the API layer as such. So you can see that this is built upon the core product of Sitecore, and then you have these headless services. These are the out-of-the-box services that get installed in your instance when you go ahead and install your Sitecore headless package. So all of these services, the layout service, dictionary service, GraphQL, all of this is available as soon as you install the package onto your Sitecore instance. And then you can build your site on consuming any of these services using any of these technologies that I mentioned here. So we will specifically be talking about .NET Core here. So if you go this route, obviously you do get the benefits that come with using .NET Core. I'm sure everyone's aware. So .NET Core as such is a rewrite of your .NET framework. So it's this also has been around for a while now, I think. But again, I don't know how many of us are using it day in day out in our during our time in development, but yeah, this has been around a while as well, and I think we're on the third or fourth version already. So there's been a lot of development even in this side of things with the ASP.NET Core. It comes with a lot of benefits, things like better portability because it's platform independent as such, so that can be quite useful, and it's also open source, and then it provides for rapid development, better security, and it's more scalable. So all of these benefits that come with the ASP.NET Core, they are inherently adapted in your solution if you choose to go with this route for building your website. All right. Now, moving on to the SDK as such, which Sitecore is providing. So again, just to reiterate, the reason to go with an SDK in this case is to make sure that your website is going to have all the, is going to be able to utilize all the features that Sitecore exposes as such. So the ASP.NET Core SDK, it provides the client API for layout service and also for the other services that we saw in the previous slide. It provides it uses the tag helper, which is the ASP.NET Core tag helper for Sidecore placeholder renderings and for field helpers as well. And apart from this, you have the features for routing and request mapping. You have the features for model binding, which basically creates the strongly typed. It enables you to do the mapping for strongly typed types to Sitecore items as such. And you have the WYSIWYG editor support as well. And in addition to this, the analytics, personalization, and testing support. So these are, I think, to me, these are the main things, the main reasons, selling points of using the SDK as opposed to just building your own, standalone site as such and working in not working in connected mode with Sitecore. So when we're talking about this kind of headless development, the main thing to understand here on an architecture level is the request lifecycle. So this was actually presented in Sitecore Symposium like 3 years back, and yeah, it's still relevant, and it was definitely the best representation I could find. So I've reused that and mentioned the source where I've taken this from. So just to go over quickly this request lifecycle. So you have the HTTP request that comes in and resolving the controller in action. And this phase of the resolution is actually a part of the ASP.NET Core framework itself. So as a part of that, ASP.NET Core MVC framework itself, so you resolve the controller and the action. Now, where you or how you inject the Sitecore middleware is by using this attribute, use Sitecore rendering, and you would use this on the controller or the action. And that would tell the control that it actually needs to execute this additional code before executing the action. And that is where it hits the layout service. So this is hitting the your rendering engine middleware after this. And what happens here is this is where the interaction with Sitecore is happening. So excuse me. So this is going to go to Sitecore and it's going to get back the JSON to you based on the configuration that has been done in Sitecore. And once it gets the response JSON, then the response JSON is made available in the rendering context and the HTTP context, which is going to be used by your code eventually to render the content. Now, once this is done, it actually invokes the action. So it picks up back here again and invokes the action. And then the razor view takes over. Now, one important thing to kind of understand here is how the link is made between the presentation and the components and everything that you have in Sitecore, and that is returned in the JSON. So between that and how does Sitecore know? How does your code know which is the component corresponding to each of these, the JSON snippets that it has received? So that mapping is done using the component name itself, which is why it's very important to have the matching component names. And we'll see that shortly in Sitecore as well, where the configuration is done. So it resolves the component using the component name as such configured in Sitecore and in the code. And based on how you have authored your views, so it renders the view and uses model binding if you have configured it to do so, and which is automatically mapping the strongly typed types to Sitecore items, and then rendering this content using the tag helpers of ASP.NET Core, and finally returning the markup. So uh, this is the request lifecycle as such, and this kind of gives the overall picture of how a good idea of what this means. Pretty much tells you how this whole and this whole new way of implementing thing works. So this being said, I'm going to move over to Sitecore now quickly to show you certain things that I have set up. So first thing we'll look at is, all right. First thing we'll look at is setting up is how, or rather the working of the layout service. And I have done as little as possible to just show you, how to get this up and running. Obviously, there's a lot more you can do, and there's a lot of setup that you can do to conform to the correct standards and based on your business needs, implement all of the coding standards and Helix principles and everything, and make it pretty and maintainable. But in this case, I've pretty much done as little as possible just to show that how less is required to just get it up and running. So in this case, I just have a vanilla website where I have gone and 10, this is a 10.1 instance where I've gone and installed the headless package. And I've not written a single line of code on this. It's a single website, a single site node as such. So I didn't have to create, didn't even have to update any config actually. So that was it. Now to get the layout service up and running, what did I need to do? So in the template section, this is pretty much how we've been doing stuff all along. There's nothing great here. So templates have been pretty much the same. Um, what you had to do in the layouts, here comes a little bit of the difference. So in the layout, I have selected, I think the JSS layout. Let me switch the language again. So this file is actually empty. It's a dummy thing. I've not updated anything there. All I've done here is selected a placeholder, which is going to be available on this layout. So you can obviously write code and stuff and give it a more of um, a traditional layout structure that we've usually seen. But in this case, I just wanted, like I said, the least I could do to get this up and running. So I've just placed a single placeholder called main, and I was actually working on a mobile app for this. So I didn't really need too many placeholders because it's all just one below the other. So I've just added a placeholder. This is how you tell the layout that these are the placeholders that are going to be available on the layout. And apart from that, when you create renderings, you have to create JSON renderings. So instead of using view or controller renderings, I've used the JSON rendering. This template came along with the headless package that I installed from Sitecore itself. Now, the most important thing here to notice is the component name. And this has to match the component name in the code, and I'll show you that as well, where it is in the code. And apart from this, the ones that these are all, I mean, your editor options are pretty much the same as what they were before. But the section that I wanted to call out is here. So you can choose to either show data from a data source like how we have done traditionally, or you can even go the GraphQL route where you can write GraphQL your queries here and to determine what is going to source the, this rendering. And additionally, there's also content resolvers that you can choose and override. So this basically tells it where or how to resolve the content based on the data source or the context item where this rendering is going to be used. And you can create your own content resolvers as well based on how complicated your source data requirements are. So these are the sections that I wanted to call out as opposed to all the others, which are pretty much the same as what we've been seeing in Sitecore all these years. So these were the two things, creating the layout, the renderings, and then after that, I've gone ahead and created um, some regular items and gone into the presentation. So remember that in this case, the example that I'm showing you, I'm just talking about the layout service now. So I haven't connected this to any UI as such, so I don't have Experience Editor working right now. But I can, especially since because of the way I kind of set this up with a single placeholder and all that, I could just go into the content editor mode and select the correct layout, add my components to the same placeholder, JSS main. I think I didn't show that. So main is JSS main, which is why that's what I've used. So yeah, these are the components that have been added. I've pretty much done like data source mapping directly. So created some data sources, set those up. So here are my data sources, set up dummy content on them. So yeah, that was the basic setup that I did. So you can see that none of this was complicated and literally zero code. So this was the setup that I did for I call the API passing in the item ID of this site home, which is the page for which I want to get the JSON. So I've set up the page, I have the item ID, I have the presentation set on this item. So I want to see what the layout service returns for me when I try to make a request with this ID. So when you call the layout service, the out of the box layout service, you do need to pass it an API key. The API key is it's modules, settings, services. Yeah. Okay. So you have to create an API key here, and you can create your um, um, what do you say? You are domain specific API keys and environment specific API keys, in which case you're going to mention what the origins are, what allowed origins are, and all of that. So using these fields, you can basically restrict these APIs to certain environments or domains. I've just left it open because I didn't want to set up too much. So this is my API key, and the item ID is the one that is going to work as the key. So this being said, and with all this setup done, you can see that I just went into Postman and hit the Sitecore API layout render JSS. So this is my layout service, and this is the out of the box service, and I pass in the item ID and the language. It's optional. It takes English by default, and or it takes it based on your site node. But anyways, so this, and I say send. So it returns to me the JSON, and in the JSON, you'll see that so this obviously because I sent it an item with a presentation and I'm using the layout service. So it's going to treat it, it's going to expect a page. And based on the layout that is set on it, it's returning back the JSON to me. So you can see that it says, okay, this is the site home page. It also accepts paths actually, and you can pass in relative paths by also mentioning the SE site name, SE site. So in this case, since I have only one site, I'm just using the item ID and not passing in the site name. So it gives you this general information, and it also then gives you placeholder wise information. So I just have one placeholder, JSS main, and I have a component called hero with this component name and certain fields, and I had another component called image spotlight content and with these fields. So this obviously fields is determined by the field types in Sitecore. So this is pretty much how, the simplest way of using the layout service in the most simplistic configuration that you can think of for getting it up and running. So just to show you, language wise, I think you can just pass in SC-lang, and um, it's going to, I don't think I've turned on fallback here. So I had set up this title AR just to demonstrate. Excuse me. Please give me a minute. Hello, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that coughing bout right while speaking. Anyway, so yeah, passing in the language of Arabic, you can see that I have the Arabic title here. I mean, it says AR, so Arabic title. So passing in language pretty much works in the same way as it has in Sitecore for a while, and you can set up things like translations and stuff, and leverage the different plugins that we have for translations and setting them up in Sitecore, pretty much in the same way how we've been doing in the past. So that was the most basic setup of the layout service. And what I have done is I haven't configured this in connected mode yet, and that is probably something I'll do in a follow-up session. But I would want to look at the code once just to show you where things are and how they are configured. So what I've done is the Sitecore MPP site was initially built using SDK, and it's a good way of kind of seeing how things should be done. I guess because they've done it really well and followed all the standards and everything. So I'm just going to look at that code. This is available publicly on Git, so anyone can clone that and take a look at things. So currently, I think I saw that most lately it's actually been archived because they moved the site to XM Cloud as such. So the main things to notice, and you can see you have the feature foundation project here in this case. So the main thing to notice here is that all of these projects, you have two different web projects here, one being called as platform and the other being suffixed with rendering. So the main difference here, and the JSON file here is they're using the CLI serialization. So you can, it's nothing to do with this, but yeah, Sitecore 10 feature, that's cool. But the main things to note here is that every feature and project as such, they have these platform and rendering projects. So platform project is what corresponds to your Sitecore instance, and these are the projects that will be deployed to your Sitecore instance. So any config updates that you need, any customizations you want to do to your Sitecore, or any custom the content resolvers that we spoke about, or custom layout service, or anything like that that you'd like to create, which you want deployed on your Sitecore instance, that will be a part of your platform project. On the other hand, your rendering projects are going to be the ones which will be a part of your front end side. They will speak to the Sitecore project as such, and they are connected in a certain way, which we'll look at, but it's not within the code, as in they talk to each other using the API that we spoke about. So your rendering is going to be your front end website as such, and it's going to be deployed to the site, to the front end site. Your platform is going to be deployed onto your Sitecore instance. So these are the main things to know. Now, to look at how these are talking to each other, so the main setting that you have where it kind of is aware of each other is in app settings. You can see that this is where the Sitecore instance information is, the instance URI, it has the API key. These are the main things needed to talk to Sitecore. You can choose to add a lot more settings as well, but the basic ones just to be able to talk to Sitecore are these that are available here. And in the code, the code that actually uses this JSON, this configuration, is here in the startup.cs. So you can see that there's a lot of code in here, which is actually here. So this is the stuff that is creating the, it's registering the Sitecore layout service client, and it's reading the API key from the config that we had in the app settings. And apart from this, it also registers the components that we have. So if we look at any one of these, say here, so remember I mentioned about the name, the component names inside core. So it definitely, it needs to correspond with the registration that you do here. So this is what ties your JSON response with the code that you're going to be having, or the code that you're going to be writing to utilize that um, JSON content that is returned from the layout service. So this is what is going to tie these two different components. And here's where you are registering the components. Apart from this, you can also register additional routes, or so routing information can also be done here. One thing to probably note is that creating custom routes here is quite straightforward, I guess. It's it's a lot easier than or it's a lot less work than when you're doing it on a Sitecore instance, just because you don't have your Sitecore routing interfering with this in this matter, just because they're completely separate. So it's pretty much as good as writing your MVC routes and making sure that those get applied. So yeah, that's pretty much what we have in the startup file. And when I spoke about the life cycle, we spoke about that attribute, use Sitecore rendering attribute. So you can see that in the controller action, this has been added. And because of this, this is basically coming from the Sitecore DLLs, and this has the functionality to call the layout service based on the information that will be passed on in the request, in the request context from the URL itself, so that it can identify which item it's trying to get the information from, and once it is returned, it's going to be stored in the HTTP context and also rendering context. So here's the use of the attribute as such. And just to look at one of the features, you can see that basic content rendering. Okay. You can see the use of yeah, you can see that they've used this strongly typed models here. And going into this, so this is going to do the come from the DLL again, the definitions of these. And then you have the tags which are available, the tag helpers. So these are the ones which are going to be showing the showing the content from the JSON while also maintaining the experience editor editability and things like that. So yeah, this is the only, I think, learning curve that is there in this case, because your razor is going to look drastically different from what it used to before. So, but this should be familiar to people who already are aware of ASP.NET Core. But yeah, this was the main learning curve for me in this case, because the rest of it actually it was quite um, easy to draw parallels based on what we've been doing all these years. But this was the one change that was there. So yeah, I think solution-wise, this was pretty much it that I wanted to show in the code. And let's go back for the presentation for a bit. I think I have a last slide in there. Yeah. So we have so many options as such available. For your front end, you have the vanilla MVC, you have your JSS, JavaScript SDKs, and now ASP.NET Core Rendering SDK as well. So what is the use case of using this ASP.NET Core renderings and the SDK? Why would you want to use this, or why would you want to go towards this? So I think I actually got this information from most of this information from Nick Wesselman's symposium presentation. So he had also mentioned about all of this, which seemed pretty cool. So the three use cases that he had mentioned was Sitecore MVC projects, which are the traditional MVC projects, which are probably have heavily customized front end and cannot really leverage SXA to the fullest. So in that case, that might be a good candidate if you're trying to move that to headless. So move that into ASP.NET Core code. It might be less of a lift and shift than trying to move SDK. So that would be one of the use cases. JSS projects, which probably do not use as much or do not require as much of a rich front end experience, or are not using things like single page applications and stuff like that. And in case you don't have that kind of team with the expertise required to work with front end SDKs as such, so that might be a good candidate as well to use ASP.NET Core renderings. And the other option was, or the other use case was for existing ASP.NET Core applications as such, which might not be tied to any CMS. But if you'd like to move part of it or all of it to be managed or to be sourced from a content management system, it would be a much easier lift and shift to include some or all of the pages into into Sitecore routes as such, and use this SDK that we have in place to make it editable or sourced from the CMS. So yeah, this is what I had to share about ASP.NET Core renderings and the SDK as such. I have a quick list of the references that I've used. Like I mentioned, Nick Vesselman's session in from Symposium was really good, and also had a good Docker-based demo of how to do this, how to set things up from the scratch and everything. So what I showed was, yeah, like I said, it was bare bones and bare minimum to get it up and running. But he definitely, in that presentation, they show how to go about it from, starting from a Docker instance and then setting everything up and how you're going to add new features and stuff like that. The official sitecore documentation is pretty good and descriptive as well as always. And the sitecore MVP code base in GitHub, which is the one I was showing you in Visual Studio. And there was also, yes, a good step-by-step documentation regarding how you can build the components. So this was also a pretty good reference. Yeah, that's all I had actually for today. I do hope to set up like a follow-up session to show a little bit more rather in-depth examples of things, including setting up search and how much what I can do with GraphQL, and also of setting up things with Helix and doing those right based on you know any integrations that I can probably think of. So I was hoping to do that and set up a more of a working session or a hands-on session. So I'm going to do that at some point, hopefully. But this was more of an introductory thing. I hope you found it useful. So that's all I actually had. If anyone has any questions, I can try to answer them, or I'll probably take them and get back to you. Or you can reach out to me on any of these channels.
You don't have any questions?
Okay.
Yes, Sumit, do you have any questions?
Yeah, sorry, I was talking on mute. So I read that GraphQL is supported with like JSS, but not with the ASP.NET Rendering SDK. Is it true?
Even in the ASP.NET rendering SDK, as in when you're using the JSON renderings itself, you can use GraphQL, right? So, and that should be supported perfectly fine.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Have any other questions? Okay, if we don't have any other questions, I think we can get this session closed. Thank you, Anindita, for the wonderful and insightful session. I also thank
Right.
all the
Thank
participants
you.
who attended this session and asked their questions on this topic. Have a nice day, everyone, and rest of the evening. Bye bye.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank
Thank you
you,
for your time.
everyone. Bye bye.
Thank you.